Recording in progress. All right. Good evening, folks. My name is Alice Hutchinson and I own Birds Books, but I know that you know that. I've opened the chat on the right-hand side of my screen, and if you would like to do the same, there is a link already in place. In case you don't already have the book, you can grab that link right there. But also, our author tonight is Camille Aubray, and her link is also up in the chat. And so if there's anything that comes up that we want to refer to, I'll research it and throw it in the link so that you can grab it. Also, we are recording tonight, and I will thank each of you for attending in an email tomorrow and send you a recording of this event. And there's going to be a couple people that can't make it because Bethel's graduation switched to tonight because of last night's rain. So that's just going to be the way it is. We'll have fun without them. Birds Books is fully open to regular hours, 6 days a week. We're closed on Mondays. We are still asking people to wear masks because we have a large number of children that are in the store. And because they haven't had the opportunity to be vaccinated, we felt strongly that they and their families feel safe. And indeed, a lot of those parents of little kids have told us that that's one of the reasons they feel safe coming into the store. And I've gotten some pushback from adults, and I just remind them it's for the sake of the kids, and they can push back all they want, but we're just going to keep the kids safe until they can,
Sure.
find a way through all this, as we're all just feeling our way as we go. I have read the book, so I am going to hope that Camille doesn't throw her hands in the air because I'm giving away something. I've worked very hard on these questions not to give away anything. I know that, Lori, you said you read it?
I did. I did.
Nancy's going to be joining us, and she said she's read it too. So I will just begin with a couple of easy ones so that we can get started. Before I forget, this book got wonderful reviews from the planet. If you can go, anybody can go out on Goodreads, and people all, I always wonder if it's a paid person saying something nice. But when you start getting good reviews from things like Publishers Weekly and some of the People and Kirkus and some of the other big name Newsweek, they're all on my website. They will continue to be. I sent a link. The last email I sent out had all the links to all the reviews. I'll send that out again. It's really worth taking a look at because they're quite astonishing. So you will be thrilled when you read this book. One of the things that I wanted to ask the author first, and this is Camille Aubray, and I ought to introduce her because that's kind of the way I'm supposed to do things here. Good heavens. Camille Aubray is the author of the novel Cooking for Picasso, which was chosen for People Magazine's People's Picks the Best New Books and the Indie Next Reading Group list. Aubray was the Edward Albee Foundation Fellowship winner and a writer in residence at the Caroli Foundation in the south of France. She studied writing with her mentor, Margaret Atwood, at Hunter College in Toronto, and was a finalist for the Pushcart Press Editors Book Award and the Eugene O'Neill National Playwrights Conference. To learn more about Camille Aubray and to see events, photos, recipes, and locales that inspired her novels, visit her website at www.camilleaubray, it's CamilleAubray.com. And so welcome, Camille. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. So nice to see you again, Alice.
Oh, it's great to see you too. And the last time we had an event, as I might have mentioned before, was for the paperback release of Cooking for Picasso. And we hosted that event in La Zingara. And so if we can pull it off, we may do a in-person event at La Zingara when the paperback comes out, because I don't know about you, but I'm pretty hungry for in-person events. But we all need to stay safe, so it's just going to be a journey to get there.
Sounds good.
So the first question I have is what about the 1930s to the 1950s fascinates you? Because clearly in your books, you have such a flavor for the time periods.
Yes.
And it's 1930s and 1950s New York. So I'd like to ask that question first.
Well, you're right. Cooking for Picasso also started in the 1930s, but that was in Europe, of course. But here, I used to work in Manhattan, and so I got to know, all these old buildings and things, and they seem to still have the history clinging to them. So, whether it was Bergdorf's or the Plaza, and in one case, the Copacabana, which was where the National Academy of TV Arts and Sciences used to have their luncheons and dinners and awards places and stuff. So I would go there, and I was kind of wide-eyed because all of the elder actors, producers, and writers who were there remembered New York, from the 40s or the 50s. And they told me stories, and they said, the Copacabana, in those days, you would bump into any kind of a person. You might bump into an actor, you might bump into a ball player, and you might bump into a gangster,
Oh, wow.
politicians, they were all there. So I started to really get intrigued with that whole period. Plus, I taught in Greenwich Village, so I knew that area, and that's why that figures into the novel too. And I found out that Greenwich Village, that was also a place where the mobsters had their social club, so bit by bit, I just kept looking and digging. And that's what happens as you're going through the research. You just uncover something that's sort of hiding in plain sight. Um, and then somewhere along the way, I came across a quote from Mario Puzo, who said that whenever the Godfather opened his mouth, he heard his mother. He said he heard her wisdom, her ruthlessness when necessary, her love of family. And he said without her, he could not have written The Godfather. So he said these characteristics of her, his wisdom and, the family and everything, he said were not entirely prized in women at that time. So that stuck with me too. I said, okay, I want to see what happens with smart women who are not, even the people who love them or know them, don't quite appreciate all of their talents, So, um, and then I just decided that I was also interested in women coming from different backgrounds coming together through marriage. So they're sisters-in-law at first. And you know how sisters-in-law can sometimes, oh, there's somebody new in the family, there's another woman. And is she accepted right away, or is there a rite of passage before she becomes one of the family? So I wanted to play with that too.
Did the history come first or the plot come first?
Oh, it's really hard to say because, I think that they inspired each other along the way. I think, as I got further into the research, I started thinking about, people and characters, and then the characters would, maybe they might go here, maybe they might go there, they might go to the Majestic Apartments, which is where Frank Costello, one of the head of the five families, lived, and so did Walter Winchell. There are all kinds of people in that building too. So these things just feed each other.
When did you start this book?
I would say, well, the actual writing, probably about a year and a half, not including the editor's input and that sort of thing. But I start reading even before I realize that that's what I'm going to be writing about. I'm reading those kinds of things. But more than that, I start taking little notes, little post-it notes in the middle of the night, little ideas and phrases and dialogue and characteristics of characters. And so those things, accrue. So it's hard to say when that started. So I would say the writing a year and a half, but there's a lot going on before that too. And that sort of overlaps with the research.
Well, tell me about your writing process. Are you list maker? Are you a binger? Are you a get up every morning and write for hours and then, I mean, how is it you work with the writing process itself?
Well, it's funny because Margaret Atwood, my mentor, said, you have to set your priorities. And if you want to get something done in a day, then it better be the first thing on your list. And it should, and that's what you should do. Don't start dusting the bureau drawer or something like, dusting the top of something. If that's what's at the top of your list, then that's what you should do. But what I find is that when I'm really working on a novel, I'm living with it. Sometimes I dream about it. I wake up with it, so I really want to get to it. I don't really have to be disciplined about it because I'm already into it. I'm into that story and that world. And that's what I want to do. So I just, sit down and
So do you
write.
shut yourself away until it's done, or?
Well, I do get very, very concentrated on it. I don't really have to actively close the world out or, I'm just in it and it's with me, um, and you go through phases, you get to a point where it gets very, very intense and you're really hard to dislodge or distract because you're really in there.
Sorry about the traffic noise.
I don't hear it.
Oh, good. Good, glad. Um, I'll ask you about publishing after we get into a little bit about the book itself, which, for those of you who may not have seen it, looks like this. Is there anything about the family dynamic that is familiar to you? Did you write at all about your own family or people you knew or people how is it you formed this grouping? Is it all
I,
fictitious? I mean,
yeah, I don't write autobiographical fiction. It's not my thing. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's just not my thing because I feel that when I start writing my characters and I hear their voices, it's usually, there's like bits and pieces of people I've known, but they're not family members. They're usually just people I knew maybe through work or there's something, voices, people's language sticks with me. I just have an ear for that. It's kind of almost like music. And so I just I think that your life's experience comes out in your novels anyway. You really don't have to be literal about it and do people that So
I'm just typing in the chat here. One question from Susan is, which comes first, the idea for the novel or a curiosity that has you start research on a topic that leads to the novel? And I think
I
we
think
kind
that
of, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I think it's like spokes in a wheel, and I think that the characters are here and the story is there and the research and the locales and but then there's that center point, that point that doesn't move. So everything else goes around, and you go through phases where you're looking at one more than the but as long as that center holds, then you're in good shape.
Do you have a follow-up question to that, Susan? Just wanted to make sure. Oh, she's typing it in.
Oh, okay.
You can unmute, folks. At this point, we're small enough. Can you talk a little about the research process? Yes, that's always a fascinating part because every author approaches it differently.
Well, obviously you're reading a lot of biography and nonfiction. In some cases you're researching the art or the cuisine and I also like to look at the music of the period because I think that's very instructive. I adore looking at the periodicals, the newspapers and the magazines and the things from that time because, the facts may not always be 100% straight. You have to always double check, but you get a lot of the language and the flavor and the color. For instance, when one of the gangsters, I won't mention the name, but when one of the gangsters gets shot, there was a whole story around that about, what the cab driver said, what the doorman said, and that stuff showed up, the day after the event. So those things are very lively. And then, of course, I look at all the side things, the advertisement of the time, and movies, I just love all of that, really.
Well, it
Because
adds so much style to your book. I mean, when you start hearing the cabbies talk about stuff and you start hearing the average person in those articles, I mean, I can remember Life magazine as a kid, and even this was years and years later. It was you can look back on Life magazine and really see the flavor of what was going on at the time. And there's not much social history unless you look back at that kind of thing.
You have to really look at everything. And, I always tell people that what you see in my novels is really just the tip of the iceberg. There is a whole, it's being held up by all this mountain of research that will not make it into the book, but it's in my head. And so I know, and therefore I know what this person would say. When I use historical figures, I want to be very true to them. I don't like to
Right.
invent about their personalities. I like to be faithful to them. So I will know what that person would say, even if he'd never met someone like my fictional characters before. I know how he would react to them, or she. I know what that interaction would be like. And I wouldn't start, a novel unless I knew that.
Do you miss some of your characters after you finish?
Yes, I love them so. I really do. Yeah. But they're sort of with me. They're still around. So,
Well, they really, you go, but because also in this case of the four of them, um, they've gone through so much and you've been there
yes,
with them going through it that I
right.
found I missed them too. I mean, it was just, um, your book has been described as history, suspense, romance, and a multi-general saga.
A
Would you,
feminist, a feminist multi-general, whatever that
feminist,
means, but it's,
way to
that's
go.
good. That's good because, it's important to defend women. So.
Did you intend to write about just women when you start? I mean, it really is, it's about the four women.
They are front and center, that's true. But I like the male characters too, the guys they marry that are in the family. And you know, I, they're good guys. They love their wives, they love their, family and their parents, but everyone has their flaws, nobody's perfect. So I try to keep everybody, the children, the in-laws, the matriarch and the patriarch of the family. I really, get to know all of them, and I want them to have their say and to, be true to them.
If you could pick one of your own characters to sit down and have coffee with, who would it be?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I mean, Philomena emerged kind of as the leader of the group, so she's fascinating. But I'd love to. There are many scenes in the book where they are sitting around the table trying to figure out what to do, hash things out. I'd love to just sit down there with them. So.
Um, did any of these characters, as you were writing them, surprise you? Because depending on your writing process, some people just let those things bubble to the surface and some people create the situation.
Mhm.
But did in the writing of each of these, of any of your characters, actually, did any one of them surprise you?
Sure. In some ways, they all do. But I can, as you were saying that, I was thinking of Lucy, the nurse, because I felt that she was kind of elbowing her way in there. And the daughters, the daughters were emerging with some, interesting takes on life. Interesting, because you have the matriarch has a certain way of looking about how, women should be, men should be, family should be. And then you have the four godmothers who are trying to move forward. It's like a passing of the baton. And then their children, they want to reach out to the larger world, but they, will step on a few landmines, or get close to them. And so the godmothers will help them, do in situations that they didn't anticipate. So I like the generational aspect of it, because to me that's how you sort of watch a family, and that moved it through those decades too. So you start at the 30s, there's a significant stretch in the 40s, and then the 50s. Now you're moving into the children's lives too. So.
Um, Susan asked another question. Are you an avid reader and how do you avoid bringing other authors' characters into your work?
Oh no, I can't see that ever happening really, because they belong in their world. It's hard for me to read fiction when I'm writing, because I just want to keep my own voices in my head. So I don't really read a lot of fiction while I'm in the process of writing. I'm reading so much nonfiction anyway for the research. Um, but no, I my characters are really so close to me that they're really closest in my ear. Everything else is kind of a distant sound.
Got it. Well, for those of you who have not read the book, I'll read the brief description, and it's the publisher who put this out. So tell me if
Right.
I'm wrong. Katrina is glamorous, the family's only daughter, graduates with honors from Barnard College despite a past trauma that nearly caused a family scandal.
Mhm.
One. Two,
Right.
Lucy, tough as nails Irish nurse who ran away from a strict girls' home, marries Frankie, the middle son. Three, Amy or Ami? Ami?
Amy. Yeah. Well, actually, sure. The French would say, Ame, but everybody calls her Amy. But it's
Amy,
spelled I-E at the end. Yes.
Amie. A
Right.
dreamy French girl from upstate New York escapes an abusive husband and falls in love with Johnny, the eldest brother. And then Philomena, clever, resourceful war refugee with a childhood secret who comes to America to wed Mario, the family's favorite son. So
Right.
it's got really diverse characters. All four of them are incredibly different.
Yes.
Um, so
And they all have secrets from their past that's sort of like baggage they don't want to take with them. They want to move into the future. They see this family as a way to move forward, with their lives. But as secrets have a habit of doing, they emerge at just the wrong time. And how they deal with those secrets and how they help each other, that's a big part of the story too.
um is the book opens with Nicole. Is she the granddaughter of
Well,
Philomena?
yes,
Okay.
Nicole. Yeah,
No,
Nicole
go
is.
ahead.
No, that's okay. Nicole is Amy's daughter, and Philomena is her godmother. So now when we start with Nicole, she's a, grown woman. She's married, and she has a reason to look back into the family past, which I won't give away. And then, so basically she's setting it up for us and saying, I knew there was something, I knew there were stories that were untold and I had to find them out. So she goes to her godmother, and the godmother's a little hesitant at first, but then she says, okay, she kind of knew this day would come, and she says, okay, let's talk. And then, you get the book. And then Nicole surfaces a couple times, but it's mostly, this story of the family as you go through the years.
Um, gathering to eat and food played a large character in your book. Are these um are there real recipes?
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
I mean, inquiring minds want to know because
Yes.
you lay a great table and you describe the food really well. And I just kind of had to know where this is coming from.
I know, when I wrote Cooking for Picasso, a Canadian reviewer said, do not read this book on an empty stomach because you will be very hungry by the end, and they used to say at least book a table at a restaurant or something. But the same with the Godmothers, there is some great food in it. And I do have recipes on my website, by the way, and I will be adding to those. But I did cook everything that was in both novels. In the case of Cooking for Picasso, I spoke to Michelin chefs in France, and they let me into their kitchens, and I got to stir their sauce and everything and be part of it. Yes, I do think food is very much a part of our lives, and it tells us a lot, and it expresses a lot, and it's also a kind of a consolation, and therefore it should be done with care. The Europeans take the meals very seriously. And so that entered into it because that's who these people were.
But you also there's another component to this, and it's sort of a very subtle underpinning, is the one of finances.
Yes.
So I really, without any spoilers, I need you to speak to that because it
Mhm.
talks about, the mob and finances and how people kind of made their way in the 30s and 40s, and it was a whole different ethic.
Well, yes. The thing about the gangsters was that, if you were running a business and you were starting to get profitable, suddenly they would show up and offer you protection from what? From themselves, and they would therefore want a piece of the action, in other words. But I think the larger issue here is the subject of debt, because, someone controls the debt. If you owe them money, if you owe money to someone, well, that's a whole situation. And the funny thing is, 19th century novels dealt with debt quite a lot. Think of Madame Bovary,
Mhm.
think of The House of Mirth, Edith Wharton, Dostoevsky, of course. I mean, Balzac, now, granted, a lot of their characters were rather wealthy people who gambled and therefore got into gambling debts, but debt is debt. And if you owe somebody money and you can't pay, you're kind of in trouble. So.
But yeah, it came up enough that I realized that even the idea that we have now, I mean, we're a credit card society, and so our whole view of financing in general and what's acceptable, but even as a child, you very seldom took a loan unless it was your house.
That's
Okay.
right. That's right. During that era, that's right. Well, um, in some cases they just couldn't, as you said, because of the credit cards, and that sort of stuff was not as readily available. Banks, might not give loans to women for their businesses unless their husbands co-signed, that sort of thing. So yeah, it was definitely a different world. But I think that, debt is a subject that, is still, with us with student loans and that sort of thing. So.
Um, I forgot to ask this question when we were talking about food, because I noticed in your notes at the end when you thanked people, you thank Jacques Pepin.
Oh, yes.
I kind of want to know about that.
He's a lovely man. I cannot say enough lovely things about him. And he read Cooking for Picasso. And I had some trepidation because I said, gee, now I'll know for sure if I got this right, and he said to me that at that time, he was commuting to teach cooking at a cooking school in New York City. So he was commuting from Connecticut. And he said that he was so absorbed on the train reading it because he said it really reminded him of his life with his mother, who ran a restaurant in France.
Oh,
Um, and, I tell you, all of the chefs, without exception, that at least the ones I spoke to, they all talked about how it was either being in their mother's kitchen or their grandmother's kitchen that inspired them to become chefs. And they are often very sentimental about it. It really means a lot to them. And so the family is in the food, the mother is in the food, and they speak of their mothers quite a bit. So Jacques told me that my novel made him homesick for his mother's coq au vin. So
oh
I
my
thought that
goodness,
was
I'd
just
love to
lovely.
taste his mother's cocoa vin.
Yeah. So I met with him. I was in his kitchen, with all the pots and pans hanging up and everything. And he was just delightful, absolutely delightful. And he chose the book for his Amazon Celebrity Picks a book. So he had chosen Cooking for Picasso for Amazon Celebrity Reads too, which was just, he didn't tell me he was going to do that.
Oh,
I thought that was very
oh, that's quite a boost.
cool. Yes. So,
Um,
yeah.
you've also mentioned that Margaret Atwood is your mentor, and what
Yeah.
is the best advice she's given you as a writer?
You
Or
know,
any advice she gave you as a writer, because I'm hungry for details on that one too.
well, it's funny because whenever people ask me that, the first thing I think of is that she said, drink more water. She was talking about writers. And, when you're working and writing, you do forget to eat and drink if you're really that absorbed. And she was saying, you got to drink water because you really need it. And she was also talking about being on tour, but she said a couple of things. And one of them was, just remember that you only have what's on the page. You have all these things in your head, all this stuff about your characters, but unless it makes it to the page, the reader will not know. And so you have to really, you know, consider that. And that reminded me of something that Mikhail Baryshnikov, the dancer, said. He said that, you have your limitations are the edges of where the stage ends. But knowing where those edges are, you can soar. You can, do these big leaps that he did, and et cetera. So the page and the stage are kind of the same, it all has to happen there. It can't just happen, in your head. It has to really make it out to the world.
That's fascinating, because I'll have author events and I'll have people in the room and I'll know everybody, but I don't realize that they don't know each other.
Right. That's right.
It's that
That's
same
right.
kind of dynamic of, unless you actually say it or speak it or write it or do it, it doesn't, I mean, nobody else knows what's going on.
That's right. So you don't take for granted that people know what you're talking about. You want to be very clear.
That's fascinating. That's a really great way of looking at it. Anything else that you would impart that you could, from a writing skill standpoint?
Oh, I'm sure there are many more that, that I have with me that I don't think of, to say, to tell to other people. But my own advice to writers is try not to, well, first of all, when you write, you can't really be thinking about, you can't write and edit at the same time, not when you're really composing. I can't even stand to have the, spell checker and grammar checker on because they're just too distracting. You go back and you fix the spelling and then lose your train of thought. So, but when you get to the point where you're editing your own work, that's the point at which you can check and make sure that you're not doing the same scene twice, because when you're writing, you might write it twice because you haven't quite figured out exactly how to say it yet. But when you go in to edit your own work, then you want to streamline it, And so to me, that process is like alchemy. You're just, going through it again and again, and you're peeling away the things that don't need to be there, and you just keep the gold.
Well, do you do everything on the page, or do you like put Post-it notes all over the wall, or do you draw a map? I know, I mean, I just watched another author talk about how they drew a timeline and kind of went off the timeline on a piece of paper.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
physically, what happens when you write? I mean, do you do, you know,
Yes.
little tiny
Yeah.
pieces of paper all over the room, or draw, or how? I mean, go ahead.
Well, sure. Yes, I have to coordinate the historical events with my characters' lives, which means I need to know when they were all my character, when they were all born, how old they were when they got married, how old they were when they had their first child, you know, if they were this age then, they were that age later, and all of that has to make sense and has to coordinate. I also had to make a chart of the five families, not so much their wives and kids, but just, their interactions with each other to make sure I kept that straight. So I had a cork board, I had Post-its, you name it. Um, but I think that after a while, you do get to know them, and then it becomes second nature.
I hadn't thought about the math part of it.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, how old were they when they started having kids, and then how old was everybody else?
right, exactly. So that they
Um,
relate to each other the right way, because people who are in their 20s are going to relate to each other and speak differently than they will in their 40s. It's just there's just a difference there. It may be subtle, but you want to get it right.
One of the questions that came up in the chat is, do you know how the novel would end when you began writing?
Yes. But I can say that I've actually compared this to driving, because it's as if you keyed into your GPS system where you want to end up, and it gives you different routes, and you take a route, but then somewhere along the way something happens. Like maybe there's a road closed that the GPS didn't know about, or maybe the GPS says there's too much traffic here. This looks like a longer road, but it's actually very scenic, and it's a better detour. You'll actually get there faster. So that's what it's like. And I think at a certain point, sometimes you may feel like you're in a snowstorm or it's night and you can only see what the headlights are showing you, but that's okay. You can still keep going. And you may do things a little differently. You may get there a little differently, but you sort of have to have a sense of where you're going. Yeah, you do.
Another question in the chat is, what writers have influenced you, and what writers do you admire?
Oh, there's so many of them. My goodness. It's funny because I always think of Colette. I found her um, very inspiring because she she managed to combine, the physical world with the soulful world, and with the intellectual world. And so it may sound as if she's just describing a woman in a restaurant smoking, but actually she's letting you know what the whole situation was with her, because her ex-husband is there. And you think it's going to go one way, but it goes another way. But she's very uh, life affirming. She's very earthy, and I found that actually useful because, a lot of the times writers are dissected in a kind of analytical, intellectual way, and it's nice to get a little more of the feeling of the earth that's under their feet.
So what other writers do you typically read? Do you have any favorites you want to share with us?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's all kinds. You know what I love? I love to look at the works that they're not so famous for. For instance, George Orwell is known for in 1984, but my goodness, if you go back and look at the Aspidistra novel and Coming Up for Air, he is a scream. And in school they made him sound pretty dour, but actually he's very funny. I mean, painfully funny at some points. And Evil Lenoir is the same way, painfully funny. I also, because of the pandemic, I went back and reread The Magic Mountain, not The Magic Mountain, the Death in Venice. And I also read Camus' The Plague. And Camus' Plague, I had the same situation, kind of like Orwell. I've known Camus for The Stranger and other stuff. But The Plague, even though it was serious about this plague, it had some really very human and very funny moments in it. And in one case, he had a character who was a budding writer, and he kept working on the same sentence over and over again through the whole novel. And the other characters, his friends, the doctors and the others, are being French, were very sympathetic, understood, and he would say, "Oh, I thought I had it just perfectly, but you see," and he would talk about how changing one word would change an implication. And as funny as it wasn't that the guy was stupid. Actually, what Camus was showing you is what it's like to be a writer, that, you can revise a paragraph or a sentence and do it for a good reason, but there might be some unintended consequence that you have to look at maybe the next day or something and say, well, wait a minute, that caused this. So maybe that wasn't the best change. Maybe I have to change that word. But he made it hilarious. So I think that whatever your preconceptions are about authors, it's good to look at the whole body of their work, because you find out that there's much more to them than just the work that they're famous for.
Tell me a little bit about your revision process, unless it's too painful.
No, I like revising, because by that time there's something there, you know. Uh, and I sometimes I'll do pencil edits, I'll do it on hard copy. Other times I'll do it right on the computer.
Oh.
It really varies. But I get a real good sense of satisfaction at the end of the day, because I know I've made it better. And, then I'll look at it again the next day, and, I just keep going until you kind of know when it's ready to move on. But I always look at what I've done, and I keep going with the rest of it too. And then if the complete book is there, I'll just keep looking at it. And sometimes you put it away for a little bit, not a long time, and that gives you a little distance. Sleep is a wonderful thing, because sleep rearranges the molecules and you can see better. Going for a walk is helpful. Getting some oxygen. I used to like swimming a lot to help free up my mind. I thought that was really helpful. There's something about water I find useful, even taking a hot bath. It makes things, come together. So no, I don't mind the revising process at all. It's all part of the continuum of doing it. And I'm just glad, there are times where you've got a lot of balls in the air and they're not quite there yet. And you say to yourself, God, I just can't die now, because if I die now and somebody sees this mess, forget it. So, I've got to at least get to, a certain stage, and then I can die.
That's so funny. Well, when you turn it into a publisher, how many edits do what do editors bring? Have you ever gotten something back from an editor and gone, no way?
Well, that happens. That does happen, but nothing is ever wasted, because, they may suggest something and you say, no, I can't possibly do that. But they make you think and you say, okay. And then you'll come up with something. It won't be necessarily the thing they suggested, but you'll come up with something new, which would not have happened if they hadn't questioned that particular spot. I can think of a number of occasions where, I said, okay. And it's very inspiring, because then you suddenly think of something that deepens what's going on with that character, So yeah, it's
That's a really
okay.
good
But
point.
I do a lot of editing before it gets to the editor, and the
Well,
agent helps too before it gets. But by the time it gets to the editor, I've really done a lot of good work on it, polishing and stuff. And actually, my editor for the Godmothers said, there are some authors, and she's an author that you want to stay out of their way. You don't want to mess it up. So they've been very respectful, and have made suggestions that, as I said, spark other things. So,
aren't you lucky?
well, I
I
think you
mean,
have to put in the work on it ahead. You can't give people something that's, a little too rough. I have a husband who writes and, is a producer and everything. So he's the one who sees it when it's at the messiest. So,
well, did you find the process dramatically different between cooking for Picasso and this book? Because the publishing industry has really changed. And I didn't know whether from your end you saw any evidence of that.
well, I'm just thinking about from my end of it. And, for cooking for Picasso, there was a lot of research in terms of researching the artwork, digging up the artwork from, some of it that was not as readily available, and the meals. And so there was, that was more, even heavier research, to do than the Godmothers. But, you know, I think you learn from book to book. I think that it's like anything, if you're a tennis player or a ballet dancer or a swimmer, you have to keep doing it in order to be in shape. And if you're in shape, you function better, you're not creaky. So
I was a theater major as an undergrad, and I had a professor that stood up and said, for every day you don't practice your art, you lose 4. And it
well,
was
you
just,
see,
and
yeah.
it was a really interesting perspective, whether that's, sort of the truth of the dynamic. I understand what the point is.
Well, that's why, ballet dancers will give a performance and the next day they're back in their tights and they're back at the bar and they're doing their exercises.
Now, when did you know that you were going to write a book? I mean, Cooking for Picasso is your first book, yes?
Well, no,
Did I miss something here?
Well, when I was 11 years old, I wrote
Oh,
a
I'm
mystery
sorry, I
novel.
must have not been there.
And I had this funny idea in my head. I do not know where I got it, which was that every little mystery book I wrote had to have 10 chapters and every chapter had to have 10 pages. I really do not know where I came up with that one,
That
but
is so
that's what I
cute.
did. So you might say I've been at it a while.
Have been at it a while. Well, your background lends itself perfectly to doing the kind of writing that you do. It seems to me, I would think. And so you seem to be very comfortable in your skin as a writer. I mean, I've
Yeah.
heard a number of writers that have written a book or two that are still kind of, oh, you still really liked it. I mean, they're kind of very insecure in
Oh,
their role as authors.
well,
And I don't
um,
see that at all in you. I see you're comfortable with your characters. You've really done the work, and you talk a lot about doing the work in advance. But it's not just the research that's the work. You've really thought through these people, and it really shows.
yes, yes, you
It
have to do
really,
that.
really
I do,
shows in the characters. No choking.
yeah, excuse me.
Um, Go ahead.
Well, I did script writing before that. I wrote for television.
That's right.
And so part of that is you just have to
Well,
get
your
it done because
dialogue is television.
the show has to be filmed and you can't just hem and haw and say, I don't feel like writing today. So you have to get that script done. And I thought that was terrific. And also working on dialogue to explain a person's character, so that you don't really have the luxury of saying, and then he felt bad and then he slammed the door and he went home and thought about his wife. You have to show it in the way that he's actually behaving and speaking. So that was good training too, I think.
I would agree with you because there are a number of books that the criticisms I have heard, and Lori can attest to it coming up in our book group, where we will discuss an author will do that. He was tall and he was wearing a this and doing that, and then he did this instead of revealing it and somebody else making an observation in their dialogue.
Yes, although I'm not saying that I don't like description. I think, in fact,
I'm not either.
friends have told me that, what they liked about, for instance, Cooking for Picasso, they said they could really see those paintings because, I wanted and a reviewer said that my approach to it was painterly. So when I describe things, I try to stay true to the thing. If it's a painting, then, I try to really let you see those colors and the brush strokes and everything. If it's a meal, I want you to feel as if you can taste it and smell it, and that you have to do with description, although a character may say something about it, but you can't rely on that alone. There is an art to the narrative as well. Yeah.
Is there a typical amount of time that you spend on research? And there's a chat question right here. Susan asked if there was a typical, we can do it. So ask your questions so everybody can see them, Susan, because I'm seeing the chat. We can just leave it open to everyone. But she asked, is there a typical amount of time or is it driven by the necessity of the material?
I've never really clocked it and said, this is how much time you have to spend on research. I just, when you're done, it's almost like like a meal, when you're full, when you have enough. And of course, it never really ends. You have enough to start writing. And as you're writing, you think of something that you hadn't thought of before. So you go back and check, so it's the research starts you off, but then there's a point at which you can't, I even think you have to distance yourself from the research, even in terms of, time and everything. I think that sometimes if someone has to write, you know, uh, a book a year or whatever, and has a deadline, it may be rushing them too much. They might not have had enough time to absorb the research, because you don't want to, you need, it's not a nonfiction book. You really need to process it.
Do you play the music of the time period while you're writing?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I
Ah,
didn't realize how many songs were in the Godmothers mentioned in it until my publisher asked me to. They were putting together a book club kit, which, by the way, is online, and I'll have to put a link for that on my website too. But there's
please
this
do, because I
really
couldn't find
lovely,
it.
yeah, there's this really lovely book club kit that the publisher made, and they asked me to, help them with it, and they asked for a playlist. So I started to go through the book, and I couldn't believe how much music was in there. So on the playlist, I put the chapters that song appears in, so that
I couldn't find a book club kit, so that ought to tell you something.
Okay,
Go back to your publisher and go, hey.
I
Because
will.
I create my questions first and then I go look at theirs to make sure I haven't missed thematically something.
Okay, I will tell them. It's very beautiful. They really did a beautiful job. So there's a playlist. I contributed cocktails. If you wanted to create cocktails to go along with it.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
there's
Please
Q&A.
put it on your website now,
Yeah, I'll do
because
that.
I put your website in the chat so people can, it's yourname.com. So it's
Right,
easy to
right,
find.
right.
But those resources make it so much fun because you have music, you have cocktails,
Yes,
the book itself is so atmospheric. You can get yourself there in terms of a time period, but to accent it with all the rest and the food and everything, it really, really helps, set the
right.
mood.
It's a really nice kit. It's a book club kit. So I will tell them, and I will put it on my website so that you'll have the link to it.
I want to open up and make sure that nobody here has any other questions. Any other questions? You just unmute yourself and ask.
Camille,
Otherwise,
did you grow up in an Italian family?
Oh, well, my ancestors, well, my parents were American born, but when you get to the grandparents and, and farther back, they were French, Italian, and one errant English woman who left England for Italy and never went back.
oh boy,
So, so I've got it,
quite a food difference there.
so yeah, there's a combination, but I think what ties it all together for me is the European, the continental traditions. They are very much informed by the church calendar, which in turn was informed by the pagan calendar. So that's very seasonal. So there are a lot of seasonal celebrations. And the meals are key to that too. Easter is a much bigger deal in Europe, even than it is here. And Christmas is celebrated a certain way, in each country. So, but it does really revolve around the meals. So, I did grow up with that.
So many books these days have one-dimensional characters, but your characters feel like real people. How do you accomplish that within the constraints of writing a complex story? That's a chat question.
Well, The Godmothers is a complex story, but I'd like to keep it complex and not complicated. There is a difference between those two. So the characters, that's the important thing when you're writing, is to not be self-conscious and say, I am a writer and I'm writing and I'm trying to, oh boy, that's a good line or something like that. You don't do that. What you do is it's as if you open a door and you're in that room with them, or you're following them and you're with them all the time. And so, you're really thinking about how they see the world, how they feel, how they interact with each other. And so you just have to be very true to them. As I was saying, I'd be true to the historical characters. Well, you have to be just as true to your fictional ones, and you have to give them the room to be themselves, but you just have to stay with them. You have to stay in that world. It's not about you.
One of the other questions, and I know that we answered this at the last event, but why Picasso?
Well, because, I was in the south of France because of I was a writer in residence at the Institute. And the idea was to immerse yourself in the culture, as you were writing. And I wasn't writing the novel then, but if you're in the south of France, anywhere you go, you're going to bump into Picasso in more than one place because he lived in different places and he left, remnants of himself there. There's the Picasso Museum, which is a fort. There is like a beautiful sculpture that he left in another town, So I kept seeing him. And then literally when I was in, I guess it was in Antibes, there was a poster because there was an exhibit, and there he was with those dark eyes, just staring right at you. And I felt that he was looking at me and saying, "What are you looking for?" And I said, "Okay, I'm looking at you. I'm going to find out who you really were," because I knew all the cliche things about Picasso, of course, but I wanted to find out about him. And then lo and behold, I uncovered this, story, this little interlude in his life that people didn't really know what happened. And I had great pleasure in exploring that, finding the paintings from that, and that's how I eventually got my fictional character.
Thank you. I have to ask this question. I know your book has only been out for a week, but are you working on something else now?
Yes, as a matter of
I'd
fact.
like to hear inquiring minds again.
Yes, I am working on another historical novel. And this, well, I can't really describe it without giving too much of it away. So I think I'm going to wait on that. But yeah, it's very ready.
Time period? Do you know?
Yes, 1930s.
Ooh, I like the 1930s. Okay. Well, we're just going to have to wait for that one.
Yeah.
But I'm looking forward to that one already because I've read this one too. Although I have to say, Camille, this is one of the few books that I have read that I would consider rereading. And that says a lot because I have, my TBR list is as tall as I am. So it is because, that's why my book group reads advanced reader copies for me and recommends books that I should buy just because my bookstore is so small. There's only a few of
Sure.
us that we just can't read everything. And there's so much, too many books, too little time. So, just the very idea that you have another book out, I think is so hopeful because I've
Oh,
loved
thank
both
you.
your other books. I mean, I
Thank you.
really have. Cooking for Picasso is a treat. We had fun on that event. This has been a thrill. I really have loved this book a lot. And I'm really, people come in and ask for good historical fiction. I can wholeheartedly hand it to them and go, I've read this and I love it here. And so it really has resonated with a number of people already. I'm sorry they couldn't join us tonight, but
Well, one of the things I love that people tell me, it's a couple of things that readers have told me. One is that as they got towards the end of one of my books, they'd say, "Oh, I don't want it to end, so I'm trying to slow down because I don't want to get to that last page."
And actually, Nancy said that to me. Nancy read it, Lori. And so she's in our book group. And she's the one I was telling you is my friend who's a Francophile. And she came and she said, I'm at the very end of the Godmothers and I can't bring myself to finish it up. And I said, I understand. I kind of want to spend more time with these people. I want to know what their children are like. Did they really love their godmothers? Did they really get to, I mean, that whole second generation. So had you considered following up on this, or is this one?
Sure. Yes, actually I have. Yeah, I do have more material for that, and I have been framing something about that.
Oh, good.
And I've also had readers tell me that after they've closed the book and they were walking around, they said, all week long, I was thinking of your characters. I felt like they were still with me. I mean, I love to hear that because that's when I know what they mean. I felt that way about books that, that I've read. So that's lovely too. So
I did feel that way. And honestly, there's only been a handful, and I mean very literally a handful, where I've had to not read anything for a few days.
yeah,
Just so that I could let it soak in.
yeah.
And
It's like
it's important to allow that to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had people write to me and say, your books are keepers. I know what they mean. I want this in my library. Yeah.
I feel that way. Well, congratulations on the publication of this book. It's been really, understanding, not many of you are going to understand the publishing industry and what it's going through right now, but to get published at all right now is very difficult. a lot of the people in the publishing industry with institutional knowledge are retiring, and the
Yes.
youngins really don't know their way very well. I mean, I know an A-list author whose publicist forgot to send it to the New York Times for review.
Gee, that sounds strange. I
So
mean, they usually, you know,
I know, but that they kind of said, here, learn on this one. And it was kind of a very unfortunate situation. And so there's little kind of gaps in the publishing industry that you're not going to experience because you have relationships with people and you've already got 2 books out the door, which is terrific. It's wonderful. Um,
yes,
but
I'm very
quite
lucky.
honestly, and you also published at the perfect time of year because people are looking for great books to take with them on vacation, to sit in the backyard with, to enjoy. So you're lucky that you sort of fell into a slot that was very productive and very prosperous in terms of great books coming out. So kudos to that,
Thank
although,
you.
you kind of, you're not, there's a lot of pandemic books coming out right now where people were sitting on material that they
Yes.
then pulled together and then threw out, and that's fine, and some of it's great and some of it's really not. And I'm small enough to try and keep the really nots out of my door.
Well,
But
a bookseller told me that she said, I sell your books every day because when people come in, they say to me, I just don't want to read another depressing something that makes me feel really lousy because we've all felt bad enough during this whole pandemic. And she said that it's funny. She said to me, even though you are talking about serious issues and things happen in the book, there's a sense of humor, but more than that, there's an uplifting quality at the end that you feel as if, you know, you just feel that it's life is good, and I don't know, that mattered to me because I was glad that some people have told me they've even had relatives that had just come out of the hospital or whatever and wanted to read something that made them feel happy again, and and that really is very touching when I get letters from people saying that, I was at the hospital and I was with a relative and I was reading your book, and I gave it to him and her because I knew that, they would feel better. So
well, it's not,
that
it's
means a
all,
lot.
that is amazing. And I think that's, I, I, th- I think that speaks well to how well you've crafted your characters. But the other thing is, there are things that happen to these characters, and not every one of them is good. But I found myself still caring about them, and that's what drives me forward in a book. Is when things are happening, I'm going, oh no, and then you kind of go, oh well, there's movement, there's something happening, there's people
Yes,
engaged, there's something, and so but there was a lot going on too.
yes, yes. I am a
You're right
firm
about the
believer.
depressing though. There's an awful lot of depressing. I know 2 books coming out. Well, anyway, but it's
Well, I do believe in story. I don't think it's enough to just create an atmosphere, although it's wonderful. You have to have an atmosphere, but I mean, I do believe that you have to have a story that, it has to evolve, Um, so, and you don't have to choose between characters and story or style and story and all that. It's not a choice. Everything comes together, you know.
no, I think there's going to be about a dozen books in the year that float to the surface in terms of, there are people that come into my store and say, I want a really good historical fiction that's not World War II. And I
Yeah.
get it. I get it.
Yeah. And you know what
Because
somebody said about the Godmothers? They said, it's not like other World War II fiction because the war is just the backdrop. It's not about the war, it's
right.
about the people that were at home, Uh,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. It's the social history behind it.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so it's like, I remember reading The Splendid and the Vile by Eric Larson, which is, of course, nonfiction and quite a tome and a big book. And it really didn't read like it, but it was about somebody's social history. It wasn't about the war and the battles and the this and the that. And so
Right.
I could read it because it was about a person. It's about these people, and you end up caring about these people because they're well developed and it moves the story forward. The circumstances of the other ones going off and going away and going fighting a war isn't really the central focus of the book.
That's right. And you try, and you don't want to write things that have been done before. You know what I mean?
Right.
At least I try to write something that's different, something that's unusual, something that because it'll be fresh.
Yeah, there's another comment in the chat about so many books these days have one-dimensional characters, but your characters feel like real people. How do you accomplish that within the constraints of writing a complex story? Did I ask that question already?
Yeah, but
Sorry, I
I,
thought, but it's still germane to our conversation.
yes, yes, it's very much what we're talking about. And that's what I mean about you have to be there with them. You have to see them as three-dimensional. If you see them as three-dimensional and you examine what makes what they're doing, what they're feeling, what they're thinking, and how they interact, then it will come out as three-dimensional. If you have just the skill to write, it will come out. But it starts with the author. You have to see them that way. And that's
Oh, yeah.
probably the biggest hurdle, is that you really have to believe in your characters. There's no point in writing about them if you don't.
Well, do you think your script writing really helped with that aspect of writing the people?
I think the script writing helped me to, write, let people express themselves in a succinct way, you know. But in terms of making them three-dimensional, I think that's more, I think, a book thing for me anyway, a novel thing. That's why I like novels so much, because, um, that's another thing that Margaret Atwood said, is that she said that somehow scientifically they were watching how the brain reacts, and they said that reading is the closest thing to experiencing what you're reading about, that you actually, the things that are going on chemically and physically inside you are as close as you can get to having that experience without actually having that experience. And they did not say the same thing for, like movies and things like that. Somehow reading, I guess, because it involves what you, the reader, contribute to it.
I'm surprised to hear that, yet I'm not at all, because I have resented sometimes seeing the movie when somebody else's imagination has filled in what that person looks like, and
Right.
their mannerisms and all of that. Um, I get that. That's really a fascinating discussion.
Yeah.
Huh. Um, and one of the chat members said a book can change you, and I have been changed by books. Definitely.
Yes. Yes.
Um, are you having to do as much research on this next book as you have on the others?
Yes, I did. Actually, I've been working on this book off and on. I tell people, here's a cooking metaphor for you. I tell people that it's like having all these different things on the stove, and some things are more on a slow simmer, and maybe they're on the back burner, and then they get moved to the front burner. Others are like a saute. It's starting to, it's moving faster. So the one I'm writing now was simmering for quite some time, and I would, I'd have to stop and work on the other books that I've been working on, but I would go back to it and do, different research. So that's been simmering for a while. Yeah.
Susan added, very true. When you read a good book, you are there in it whenever you were reading. Yeah, I get it.
Yes, and maybe that's why people say that it stayed with them, after they'd finished the book and they were walking around, or, driving to work, and they were still thinking about it. Maybe it's because it's almost like your own memory, that you've been there. See?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, if you're going to throw yourself into a book, you've thrown yourself into a book. So it
Yes.
travels with you. I mean,
Yes.
how many of us can remember the books that we read in high school, like the one book that really got in there?
Right.
And most people can name that book. Anyway,
Most of them had been banned, but that's another story.
that's true.
A true sign.
Those of
something
us
with
frisky
the-
enough to read some really spicy stuff. Yeah, I know. Takes very little to get banned these days, it seems.
Camille, I
Do we
love,
have any other questions that they want to throw in? Lori, did you?
I wanted to make a comment. I loved the women.
Good.
And here's why I loved them. Yes, they were all flawed, but they were all strong. And yet you were not hammering that at us. It wasn't like, I am woman, see me, hear me
Right.
roar. And all of their flaws ended up being what wove them together as a family. It was beautifully thought out.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that they were very human characters, in the sense that, that the flaws make them human. And so therefore, I think they were earnest, and
Mm.
maybe that's why people cared about them, because they had a good intention, even if they screwed up. So.
Denise said, I like getting lost in, I like getting lost in a book, quote unquote. English teachers call it being in the reading zone.
Mhm.
It's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, it's a good place to be.
Any
Especially if
other
there's a,
questions, folks? I'm sorry, Camille. Go
no, I was
ahead.
gonna say, especially if there's a pandemic raging out there, sometimes you want to go into another world.
It's interesting. I'm starting to hear the vocabulary of this was my pandemic book.
Right,
The
right,
book that kind of got them through that moment they didn't think they were going to make it,
right.
or psychologically was going whatever. I mean, this is my pandemic book. And it's interesting how people identify that book and what it,
And now what I'm
how-
hearing from people is like, release from the pandemic. I get to go to the beach and I can read your book and, so, now we're moving out of it. And that's
yeah,
just
but
as
I read your book during the dark times and it got me
you
through.
did. You did. Yeah.
So
Unlike the public. That's right. You got an early one.
I read it during the before times, not the before times, during the dark times. And
Right,
it got me
right.
through because I really could go to places and be with these four women. And really, now, of course, that's going to be their perspective. And that's great. That's great. I love that they want to take a leap. But I'm mostly getting people going, I really want great historical fiction. And I just hold up the book. I go, you got to read this book. And it's great. It's wonderful. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? Did you see any of the real life gangsters in your book as having any good qualities?
Yes. Yes. Because, people are multifaceted. And some of these guys, after all, they were criminals, but they were also very touching. They knew that they probably weren't going to end well, as the life of the gangster is, and they wish that they had, other opportunities. That this is not a world that they went into because they thought it was cool, despite what you may see, in movies and things. Actually, the farther back you go, there were less swagger among the gangsters, and it was more just, the necessity of living in the times they were living in, and that was the only way they could survive. At least that's how they saw it. Um, and so they didn't think they were, whoopee, imitating, movies they'd seen or anything like that. So I found some things very touching, actually. Yeah.
Well, our time is just about up. I just wanted to make sure that anybody didn't have any other quick questions.
Okay.
Well, Camille, I got to tell you, you can tell how much I love this book, and I really am thrilled to pass it on to other people. And I know I've heard nothing but great reviews from the people in the chat and the others that have already purchased it and read it. So I'm sorry they couldn't join us, but we do have a recording that I'll pass along to them, and I'm really
Great.
excited about that too. So thank
Terrific.
you. I know we were a small but mighty group. I hope you had as much fun as we did.
Absolutely. Thank you, folks. It was
Really.
lovely to see you all.